This is very easy to have us plunge into despair. So there isn't anything we could do about these brokers who allow all this deniability through the step-by-step, stepwise progress up the supply chain. We already have questions coming in about, oh, come on, please, what can I do? And we've already gone over this. So, I just have to read something that's so telling and so good that you said in an interview. Our food options allow us to express meaning. That is, food that allows us to demonstrate who we want to be, whether that's worldly and sophisticated, thin and athletic, decadent and indulgent, ecologically virtuous, connected to our ancestors, distinct from our kid, etc., down the line of human aspiration. So our buying choices and the romanticism of voting with our buying dollar, does that work? What can we do in a grocery store to try to improve labor conditions?
Okay. So one, I would say the take-home message of this book for me was an abandonment of this vote with your dollars mentality that I grew up with. That Eric Schlosser, Michael Pollan really introduced me to. Eric Schlosser ends Fast Food Nation, a book I loved, was very influential to me growing up. With "Make it your own way," the Burger King kind of slogan inverted, and guess what? We can create the system we want by making informed consumer choices. And I guess I reached the end of that paradigm in this book because of things like the Thai shrimp industry, where there were so many levels of obscurity between top and bottom that well-intentioned people within the industry who were buyers, whose whole job it was to source, people who are working at NGOs in the sector, whose whole job it was to demonize and call out bad actors, couldn't tell you who to buy from and who not to buy from when you were talking about a certain scale. Like, of course, they could point to one or two good farms, but when you get to a certain scale, they would throw up their arms. They wouldn't have great ideas of how to reform a supply chain. Now, this isn't universally true of every, category in the grocery industry, but certainly for some of our big commodities, it is. Then you take that dynamic of invisibility and you add in marketers and you add in an auditing system that is geared to making promises, which again we haven't really touched on. And you get these layers that interrupt you from the actual conditions on the ground and that make a choice that you think you're a supposedly informed choice, not super informed. So that's the negative. Now let's get to the positive, which I think is there are programs like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that you mentioned, Migrant Justice in Vermont, do their Milk with Dignity program that are doing really fantastic things, amplifying workers' rights, really shifting away from an auditing system that guarantees our food. And the auditing system is basically a snapshot of a company through prearranged visits. They go, they check financial records. They don't typically interview employees. It's just looking, it is debatably okay for empirical things like food safety, where you're like tracing a pathogen. And I think you can make an argument, at least, that it has had some role in that reform. When you get to something like a withheld paycheck at a place, and especially a withheld paycheck that was withheld 6 months ago from when the auditor visits in a language that the auditor doesn't speak, it becomes meaningless. So what these new programs that really emphasize worker to worker education, raising worker rights, and putting hotlines and apps. I know it sounds silly, but like workers have access to smartphones, giving them ways to raise their voice. A huge factor in this is like, do these organizations have a permit to go on site and talk to workers, engage with workers directly? Auditors don't have that right. They come for a pre-arranged visit, often with extreme restrictions on who they can and cannot talk to. So these programs that are worker-driven social responsibility, I think of that as a real bright spot, a real place where we could pour more resources in. The downside is they're not scalable. They inherently work on like local knowledge, deep in like roots, building trust with workers. And so you're not going to get a program like that and then like poof, now it's going to cover even the whole East Coast. Migrant justice is great in Vermont. They're not something that you could just take and transplant to Texas.